Hello and welcome to our 22nd video on extreme fundamentalism. Today I'd like to continue with our fourth in the series of the extreme fundamentalist war on Calvinism. What is at the roots of that? And I thought I'd finished with the last one, but something came to mind that I think I need to cover, and that has to do with the influence of Charles Finney. Perhaps you've heard of him. He may have been quoted from your pulpit or held up as an example. Finney, he came on the scene about 1823, and he came with a lot of new methods. He was ordained, licensed to preach as a Presbyterian. He was not a faithful Presbyterian, or he wouldn't have been doing what he was doing, but his methods of evangelism were such that he was looked at with suspicion by some of the older revivalists. I mentioned last time a man by the name of Asahel Nettleton. Nettleton, I mistakenly quoted him as being from Jonathan Edwards' time, but actually he was a contemporary of Finney, which was several years later. Finney was, he'd looked to Asahel Nettleton for examples in preaching revivals, because Nettleton was very successful in his preaching, but he had a very different style of preaching. And Nettleton did not care for Finney's style, and he would not associate himself with Finney. But Finney, when he came up for his license to preach in the Presbyterian Church, was asked if he accepted the doctrinal standards of the Presbyterian Church, which was the Westminister Confession. And he said something like, well, as far as I've read it and I understand it, yeah, I accept them. But he never really read the Westminster Confession and the doctrinal standards. So he was pretty much lying through his teeth when he said that. He left kind of like a Clinton-esque type of an answer with them. And these fellows probably should not, actually they should not have ordained him, given him a license to preach, but they did, and the results speak for themselves today. The Presbyterian Church since then has fallen into apostasy, doctrinal errors, and whatnot. Finney was best known for his revival successes. He would go into an area with his style of preaching, with his excitement, his methods, that he would have hundreds and possibly even thousands of converts, primarily in the, I think it was the upper New York area or somewhere in the New York area, New York State. He's less known, however, for his blatant doctrinal heresies. Now, this is evident by the fact that Dr. Billy Graham considered him somewhat of a hero, someone to be emulated. The Salvation Army, as well, the early Salvation Army, emulated Finney's methods in their evangelism, and even fundamentalism today does. There was, several years ago, a conference, which I remember reading it and seeing an advertisement in one of the local, not local, but national fundamentalist papers, either the Sword of the Lord or Biblical Evangelist or something like that, which advertised a Charles Finney conference. I have since tried to locate that. I've tried to see if they pursued that any further. I cannot find anything, any evidence of that. But I know at one time that at least it was advertised. I don't know how far it went. But I think what happened was perhaps some people got wise to Finney by actually reading what he wrote and saw his doctrinal heresies, and perhaps they thought it wasn't such a good idea to have conferences named after Finney. He said concerning several things, he was way off. Concerning imputation, that is, where Christ's righteousness is imputed to us and our sin is imputed to Christ. He says, I could not but regard and treat the whole question of it as imputation as a theological fiction. That is, Christ's righteousness and obedience are not imputed to us. He had real serious problems with that area of justification. Salvation itself, he was fuzzy on that, very similar to Roman Catholicism in some of his actual teachings. The doctrine of original sin, he believed very blatantly that was not the case. You weren't actually born affected by Adam's sin. You did not inherently possess the sin of Adam. But he held to it what's called a Pelagian view, that you enter the world as a blank slate. Your environment kind of affects your attitude towards sin, rather than the fact that you are internally corrupt because of Adam's sin. So the substitutionary atonement, there were some things involved with there, with that would if a person was a serious theological student and looked at Finney's teachings, they would keep him at arm's length at the very best. They would not embrace him. However, fundamentalism has embraced at least his methods, and his persona, his evangelism, and things like that. His legacy survives today in fundamentalism and in American evangelicalism. It's been exported all over the world and affected Christianity all over the world. Modern proponents of Finney either ignore these doctrinal problems, serious doctrinal problems, or they choose to overlook them, one or the other. If you want to learn more about that, we're in, obviously, our 10 minutes here, 14 minutes, or whatever we may have, isn't the place I can go into great detail, but you're able to get this online, his 1851 version of Systematic Theology by Charles Finney. And if you want to really get into that, read through that sometime, and you'll see what we're talking about here. His legacy, now listen to what he did, and you'll be able to see how this influenced fundamentalism. He introduced what's called the anxious bench, what we now know as the altar call. If you look at all the evangelists prior to 1824, Whitefield, Wesley, some of the others when you go further back, Welsh revivals, you will not find this thing called an altar call. Now today, if you don't have an altar call, you're considered unorthodox. I've had a man leave, as I mentioned before in one of our videos. We had a man leave our church because we don't have what's called an altar call. We invite people to Christ, but we don't invite people to the front. Well, they didn't do that prior to 1824. That's, 200 and some odd years ago. The confrontational, loud preaching, the really super excited type preaching, that where you confront sinners, that you see on YouTube now, where people are pounding the pulpit and yelling and confronting sinners, and that sometimes actually insulting sinners. Finney was big on that. He believed that revivals could be manufactured. The history of the church, we recognize that revivals come from the Lord, something that we ask God for. We work, we evangelize, we preach, we teach the Bible, but only God can produce a revival. Well, that all changed with Finney. You see it even advertised among evangelical fundamental churches, where they'll have in a newspaper or on a sign, revival, and then such and such a date. We're going to have a revival here. Oh, how do you know you're going to have a real revival? Revival is something that has to come from the heart, and only God can change the heart. But Finney had believed that if you applied the right methodology, you did the right things, said the right things, then people are going to be revived. You're going to have revival. It's just a matter of applying that methodology. And the problem with some of the old preachers, even though they were faithful with the Word and preached constantly the Word of God, and they did not see these mass conversions that Finney saw, well, then it's because they're not using the right methodology. You see, that has filtered down into fundamentalism as well. That success can be measured by numbers of converts. Finney was real big on that, and that has, of course, filtered down into modern extreme fundamentalism today. Let me just read a little bit of Finney here. I used to say to ministers, whenever they contended with me about my manner of preaching, and desired me to adopt their ideas and preach as they did, that I dared not make the change they desired. I said, show me a more excellent way. Show me the fruits of your ministry. And if the fruits of your ministry so far exceed mine as to give me evidence that you have found a more excellent way than I have, I will adopt your views. And then he goes on to say, the results unspeakably surpass the results of yours. My results unspeakably surpass the results of yours. So because I have more converts, then therefore my methods are right, whether they're biblical or not. Whether you can go to the book of Acts and see them, or see them throughout the New Testament, whether or not you can find them there, it doesn't matter, as long as they're producing. And I remember the same thing when I sat under Dr. Jack Hyles. If somebody criticized him, he would say, where are your souls? Well, look how many thousands I have. I mean, you're telling me your little dinky church where you are, such as my church here in the middle of rural Pennsylvania. We have a few saved here and there, and we're thankful for that, but we don't have the hundreds, thousands of converts. Well, I have no voice. If I was to meet with some of these preachers, well, who are you to tell me, that what I'm preaching is wrong or an error? When look at the results. You see the exact same thing with Charles Finney. So I cannot criticize them because I don't have the same numbers. So the effects today are identical to the effects of Finney back in his day. When Finney would go into these areas, and primarily the New York area, he would go in, have his revivals, he'd have his hundreds, thousands converted. The problem was when he would leave and go somewhere else, then almost immediately these people began to trickle away. They began to fall back into their old ways. They weren't actually transformed. They would make their decisions and all this religious fervor and excitement, and as soon as that excitement died down, then they would fade right back into what they were, back into the world. So the next revivalists would come in, do the same thing, and then you'd have it all over again until finally it just didn't work anymore. People had had enough. Well, what he did was create what became known as the burned out district, burned over district. And what that was they had enough of religion, but somebody went behind Finney and then had great success in what he wanted to do, and that was Joseph Smith. Finney actually laid fertile ground for Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith went into that area in his part of New York, was able to gather a bunch of followers who were tired of all this religious fervor. They were looking for something else. It didn't work for them. I made several decisions, and I just went back to the way I was. So Smith came in with his cult of Mormonism and began gathering his converts. And you see the same thing today. Back in 2007, I think it was, that they did I think it was the 1980s when they actually started this. They did a survey, and they found that of the 290-some thousand Mormon converts, 40% of them were Southern Baptists. Or from that type of a background, that independent fundamentalist type of a background, because they had no real solid theology. They had been taught a decisional type regeneration, and their hearts were never really transformed. They'd fade away. And the Mormons came back, started picking up the pieces, gathering up the converts, and they were given something obviously not true, but the way that it was set up, it was something that they could get into. So rather than being born again, they were just simply prepared for the Mormon church. So his hatred of Calvinism is something I like to close with. Finney was a former Presbyterian, and he hated what he called hyper-Calvinism. But to him, hyper-Calvinism was just regular, what we would call five-point Calvinism taught in any Presbyterian, Orthodox Presbyterian church, or our church, which is an independent church. We would teach just a basic Calvinism, the same as Whitefield or John Bunyan or others. He called that hyper-Calvinism. He was very much opposed to that because these ministers confronted him on his methodology and his doctrine. He didn't like that, and he would speak very much against it and against the ministers and criticize them. That has carried over into modern fundamentalists as well. Now, they are actually the modern day followers of Charles Finney. So just to give you another reason behind this hatred that you see among the extreme fundamentalists, that is actually the source, I believe, part of it, from Charles Finney. So if you have any questions or if you have any comments on that, you could leave it in the comment section. I challenge you to do the research yourself. You do a simple Google search, you'll come up with all these articles, all the Finney's doctrine, his methodology and whatnot. You can find that on YouTube as well. And I'd like to again thank you for your time.